Now, if you are just a Marvel fan or a fan of good movies in general, I'm sure you know Ghost Rider as the flaming skull on a motorcycle. But in reality, he is quite literally the living version of a judge, jury, and punishment combined in one, which is fused with a unique anomaly that turns guilt and sin into weapons, and that is the spirit of vengeance. Depending on the era that we're talking about, the thing inside the host might be Zarathos, the noble Kale, a shard of some ancient medallion, or even the murderous ghost riding shotgun in a muscle car. But the few things that they all have in common is that hellfire runs through their bones. Chains are used more like limbs rather than tools, and the scariest part of them all, whenever a sinner looks into their fiery gaze, they are quite literally forced to experience the pain they inflicted on others, regardless of whether they feel guilty. In today's video, we will be talking about the spectral anatomy of Ghost Rider himself, where we will discuss everything, starting from how his curse works, why his skin and flesh literally ashes away when he transforms, and why different hosts turn the same skull into different kinds of justice. You can already tell that this video is going to be filled with information that you may have never known about, so grab a bucket of popcorn and a pair of sunglasses, because you are about to witness hellfire right in front of your eyes. What is Ghost Rider really? Is he a demon, spirit of vengeance, or a possessed human? I have seen a lot of people ask this question, and many of them have gotten it wrong too, but to be honest, Ghost Rider is usually a fusion of a mortal host and a supernatural force, most often called the spirit of vengeance. But that was not always the case either. We all remember Johnny Blaze, right? Nicolas Cage played him in Ghost Rider and Ghost Rider 2 Spirit of Vengeance. Well, his comic counterpart made his first blazing appearance in Marvel Spotlight number 5 back in 1972, where the supernatural being inside of him heavily implied that he was an entity later revealed as Zarathos, whom Mephisto bound to Johnny. That single origin splits into two very different readings depending on which era of comics you are reading. Some comics treat the Ghost Rider as a manifestation or fragment of divine judgment which was released into the human world by being tied to a mortal human in order to bring justice and to punish the wicked, while other comics said and did a complete 180-degree turn, as they made the Ghost Rider a literal demon on loan who only served his master Mephisto and used human bodies as nothing but convenient vessels to do its work without any issues. What ties it all together is that Ghost Rider is not just one person. It is quite literally a mantle. Johnny Blaze, Danny Ketch, Alejandro Jones, and Robbie Reyes all became Ghost Riders through completely different mechanisms. One turned into him due to a desperate bargain, one because he had a mystical bloodline, another was due to a deliberate transfer of power, and one because of a haunted engine. Every single time, the method was different, but the anatomy was the same. The only way a Ghost Rider would come to be was if there was a host and supernatural entity, although Robbie originally bonded with the human ghost Eli Morrow, ready to take over the host to finish its job. The whole idea of Ghost Rider depends on this small detail, and trust me, before we get into Hellfire, Change, or the Penance Stare, you must understand the Ghost Rider was never just a single entity from the beginning.
Look into my eyes.
How does Ghost Rider's transformation change the body? The moment Ghost Rider takes over, the human body underneath does not just get stronger, it gets replaced, at least on the surface. The person whose body is acting as the host appears to have his flesh burned away, while revealing a skull that houses a scary and demonic flame, which lights up the eye sockets from within. That breaks down everything basic biology stands for. Even the clothes seem to change in a mysterious way, almost like they got tainted and roughened up by fire itself. And this is not just any costume change either. It is a sign signifying that the body has finally been taken over by the demon completely. Now, if you thought this was it, then you would be incorrect, because the skin is not where the transformation stops at all. Whatever the host is riding changes with him. Johnny Blaze's motorcycle, yes, the iconic one with flames on it, it mutates instantly, becoming a flaming steed that defies gravity and rides up walls. Danny Ketch transforms in a cemetery in Ghost Rider No. 1, 1990, where he was transformed after touching the mystical motorcycle's gas cap. And Robbie Reyes, oof, he gets a possessed muscle car instead, and the whole vehicle becomes part of the curse the moment he gets behind the wheel. The entire Ghost Rider form runs purely on Hellfire and Spirit, so there is basically no use of any muscle or organs at all. In some stories, the Ghost Rider form seems to overlap the human body, meaning that it is lying in there somewhere, just not visible to everyone, while in the others, the overlap is almost full, meaning that when the Ghost Rider is active, the human body is fully replaced. And you want to know the best part about it all? Turning into Ghost Rider requires a trigger, and that trigger can be anything, starting from darkness, to danger, to a sin being nearby, or even emotional spikes. Hence, if a crime is committed even near the rider, the person committing the crime had better be prepared to face judgment.
I'll be watching. Forget about friends.
What did Mephisto actually do to Johnny Blaze? Johnny Blaze's origin started with a deal gone horribly wrong, or was it? In Marvel Spotlight number 5 from 1972, Johnny turned to Mephisto to save his mentor and father figure, Crash Simpson, who was dying from a terminal illness, and in order to seal the deal, he offered Mephisto his own soul in exchange for Crash's life. Mephisto happily agreed to the deal, but as we all know, the devil is in the details, and before Johnny could even celebrate saving his mentor, Crash passed away while performing a stunt that he would not even think of performing back when he was sick. The thing was, Mephisto had kept his part of the bargain, but Roxanne prevented him from immediately claiming Johnny's soul. Johnny remained cursed. That would literally dictate the rest of his life for him. What Johnny did not know was that the curse that was put upon him was not just a curse of ownership, but also the curse of transformation into a host for a demon called Zarathos, who was the demonic force that became Ghost Rider's power source. This means that every time his skin burned off, every time he laughed crazily during transformation, every time his mortal body died, all of it was because of one bad bargain that was made out of grief and love. On an anatomical level, Mephisto has already rewired what Johnny even is. His soul has been fully shackled to an avenging entity that now shares his body permanently, whether he wants it there or not. Although the stories slowly started to soften up a bit and started to push the storylines where the Ghost Rider was possessed by the spirit of vengeance, the emotional aspect of the Rider never really got remodeled. And honestly, I am really happy about it because Johnny's origin defines Ghost Rider as a tragic anti-hero where saving one person costs him the chance to ever be fully human again. Who is Zarathos, and how is he different from other spirits of vengeance? Zarathos is not just a title or a power source. He is an ancient, distinct entity tied specifically to Johnny Blaze's version of Ghost Rider. Although the entity was not yet called Zarathos in 1972, later stories portrayed him as a divine punisher and a demon that would devour sinful souls in one go. The best part was that this iteration was believed to be so powerful that he could rival the likes of Mephisto himself, which in itself is a crazy feat. It was almost like a rivalry between him and Mephisto. And to be honest, this was quite important because this rivalry is the sole reason why Mephisto went so far as to find Zarathos a host that would bind him and suppress him so that he could still have control over Zarathos. Once the stories started to progress, they also got more and more complicated because Zarathos folded into a much larger system involving the Medallion of Power and the broader network of spirits of vengeance, which heavily softened his identity from singular demon into one piece of a bigger cosmic puzzle. If this were any other demon, I would not really complain about it. But in Zarathos' case, this change was kind of necessary because Zarathos has always had a will of his own, and that has not changed, even if the host was not Johnny Blaze. Zarathos himself is a personality that has everything from history to hunger to even his own personal grudges. That distinction is exactly why Johnny's version of Ghost Rider tends to feel more overtly demonic and dangerous than some of the riders who came after him. What is Hellfire and how does it work inside Ghost Rider? If we are talking about it from a comics point of view, Hellfire is the supernatural flame that powers everything Ghost Rider does, and unlike ordinary fire, it burns souls, guilt, and life force just as easily as it burns physical matter, often ignoring the kind of durability that would protect someone from a normal blast. If you have read or even heard of the classic fights that used to happen with Johnny and Ketch's versions of Ghost Riders, you would be aware that Hellfire was so powerful that it quite literally tore through numerous mystical beasts and monsters who could usually tank hits that were much more conventionally harder hitting. Another fact about Ghost Rider is that Hellfire shows up quite literally everywhere in his arsenal. It blasts from his hands and mouth, it envelops the rider's weapons, and it even forms a constant aura around the head and bike, especially in Johnny's case, while when it comes to Ketch, Hellfire literally coats the chains directly, making the chain more like a soul whip with fire damage than anything else. Funnily, Hellfire actually acts like a Ghost Rider's circulatory system, and even his fuel source at the same freaking time. Hellfire drives his movements, helps him regenerate from whatever attack damages him, which there are few by the way, and it also powers up his attacks so that they deal more damage than they already freaking do. The best part about Hellfire is that it changes depending on the host. Johnny's classic flames run a deep orange, Danny's are visually updated for a slightly different tone, and Robbie's feel less like fire and more like an infernal engine running hot under the hood. How does the penance stare punish its victims? Ah, the infamous penance stare. We have all seen it and we all love it, especially the transitions that they showed in the movies. But what exactly is the penance stare and how does it punish the sinners? Well, the penance stare is Ghost Rider's signature weapon, and it works nothing like a normal attack. Whenever someone locks eyes with the Ghost Rider, they are automatically forced to relive every single memory, every ounce of pain that the person has caused to others, all at once. This sudden surge of pain and memories often leads to the person having a total mental collapse, and in some cases, it also damages their soul directly. This ability was first introduced and popularized during Danny Ketch's run, starting in Ghost Rider No. 1 in 1990 and continuing through the issues that followed, before later Blaze's stories adopted it as well. There is one thing that needs to be completely cleared, and that is that the penance stare is not some special laser eye or a mind trick. No. It is quite literally like a mirror being put in front of the person through which they see everything they have ever done. And it is possible because the Ghost Rider actually has access to souls that are filled with pain and seek revenge. Now, I know this ability sounds overpowered as hell, but there are a few major drawbacks that have actually allowed people like Frank Castle to survive it too. The thing is, the penance stare goes deep in the person's soul and pulls out the suffering they inflicted on others, and that is the catch. Lack of remorse alone is not a universal immunity, despite inconsistent exceptions in some stories. Soulless or otherwise unusual beings have sometimes resisted it, depending on the story. Funnily, most of the time the penance stare has been used in the comics, they have usually been a failure, not a victory. And that just goes to say that although it is a powerful ability, it is not an automatic win button for the Ghost Rider. Why are Ghost Rider's chains treated like living weapons? Ghost Rider's chain has never been a prop that he just happens to carry around. In most depictions, it is actually mystically bonded to him, and it is able to extend, coil, and ignite with Hellfire while obeying his will the way an extra limb would. Danny Ketch's fights are quite literally the best representation of this because in these fights, you can clearly understand that the chains are a huge part of his toolkit. And even Johnny Blaze's comic run slowly adapted this later on, giving him a more deadly look. Now you might think that it acts like a hand or a leg, but in my opinion, picturing it more like an external tendon or a nerve is a better representation of it because it is, after all, a flexible ranged execution tool that lets Ghost Rider strike, restrain, and travel in ways his body alone could not and should not be able to manage. The chains are not just weapons though either. They allow him to tie up his foes, instill Hellfire directly on them, and it also allows Ghost Rider to swing between buildings. Another extremely underrated thing that the chains can do is that they can directly exorcise spirits. As hellfire flows through the chains, if the chains come in contact with the spirit, it immediately turns to ashes on the spot, just like the one scene we saw in the movies. The chain is clearly a part of his organ system in the same way the skull and the hellfire are, where it expresses the rider's reach far beyond what his immediate body could physically cover on its own, and turns distance itself into another tool for vengeance. How hard is Ghost Rider to kill? This is a question that has numerous ways to be answered, and all of them depend on the version of the Ghost Rider we are talking about, to be honest. The human host, whether that is Johnny, Danny, or Robbie, can be hurt or killed like anyone else while he's still in his normal form. But when they are in their Ghost Rider form, the script flips completely because we all know that bullets, tanks, and even some celestial level weapons cannot hurt Ghost Rider. This is because on an anatomical level, Ghost Rider is actually made up of hellfire and spirit, not flesh and blood. So the bones that we see are not just normal bones, and breaking them apart rarely does anything to the rider, because the curse is still alive and thriving. Even when a host dies outright, the spirit inside him frequently survives the loss and goes looking for a new body to bond with down the line. And at times, out of desperation, it is also able to bring the host back to life, just like Venom. Many people tend to compare Ghost Rider and Wolverine because they assume that Ghost Rider actually has a healing factor. But the thing is, Wolverine's healing factor comes from a rare gene mutation that literally repairs him, whereas Ghost Rider fixes himself up by using mystical powers rather than having a natural regeneration process. This difference is exactly why real threats to Ghost Rider almost always target the spirit, the bond holding host and spirit together, or the host's soul directly rather than aiming for the skeleton standing in front of them. What are Ghost Rider's real weaknesses? When it comes to Ghost Rider's weaknesses, they tend to circle around a few different points, meaning that instead of just having one single rule, they may change depending on the situation or circumstance. Divine or holy power shows up as a threat depending on the era, since some stories position the rider as sometimes vulnerable to particular divine forces, even when his own origins are murky. Due to this, magic and mystical arts are also sometimes really dangerous for our rider, because if there is a proper exorcism going on, it can very well tear apart the curse from the host, and then the spirit would either go for a new host or travel back to hell. And the host would be nothing but a vulnerable human who most probably can be killed in a single blow. You remember how I compared the Ghost Rider to Venom? Well, many a time people have openly exploited their relationship to tear them apart from each other, because the entire curse stays strong as long as the spirit and the host have hope and trust in each other. The worst part is that if by any chance the enemy figures out how to kill the host before he can transform, then it is automatically game over, and that is why in a few iterations Ghost Rider rarely ever reverts back to his human form. Ghost Rider is probably the one character whose weakness keeps on changing or shifting on a run-to-run basis, at least more than any other Marvel character that I know of. Mephisto and other Hell Lords have repeatedly manipulated or limited Johnny's power directly. Danny Ketch has also faced magical seals and exorcism attempts tied to Noble Kale and the Medallion storylines, and Robbie Reyes is often targeted through Eli Morrow, and just as often through his love for his disabled brother, proving that family is as much a weak point as anything supernatural. How did Danny Ketch and Noble Kale turn Ghost Rider into a legacy myth? We all have heard of Danny Ketch, and his introduction in Ghost Rider #1 from 1990 changed the entire feel of the mythology, once and for all. As we all know, his origin actually begins in a cemetery when, during a moment of extreme desperation, he was approached by a mystical bike that seemed to be waiting for him specifically. Unlike Johnny's story, which started with a deliberate bargain, Danny's transformation felt much less like a deal and much more like destiny catching up with him, something that was always going to happen whether he wanted it or not. There is a subtle shift in the story, and this was made because it redefines the meaning of what being Ghost Rider actually means. Late in the 1990 series, another huge revelation took place when Noble Kale was revealed as Danny's ancestral spirit of vengeance, meaning that this was Danny's destiny all along. Fragments of the Medallion of Power apparently tie the Ketch family to Ghost Rider power across generations. And you know what that means? The curse is not just something that happens to one unlucky person anymore. It becomes entirely hereditary, buried in the family bloodline, waiting to resurface when it finds a suitable host. This sudden change actually made the Ghost Rider more like a cursed relic of sorts, where families were given the ability to turn into the Ghost Rider, but only if they were suitable enough to take up the mantle. In my humble opinion, I loved this shift, because we never really got to know a lot about why Johnny specifically got selected and about his past, but in this one we did. Another thing that many realized was the fact that from this storyline, taking up the mantle made it natural to come across evil almost all the time, and that was something Johnny had to face too, but on a smaller scale for sure. This distinction matters more than people usually realize, because a lot of what fans picture when they think Ghost Rider, the penance stare, the 90s aesthetic, the cemetery bike, all of it actually comes from Danny's era specifically, not from Johnny's original run at all. What is the Medallion of Power and why does it matter? The Medallion of Power is one of the most important artifacts in Ghost Rider's mythology, since it is literally the object that ties together Zarathos, Noble Kale, and multiple Ghost Rider hosts across different eras, turning what looked like separate, unrelated origin stories into pieces of one larger puzzle. Remember I said that Johnny's origin was kinda iffy? Well, it may get some clarification soon, so keep watching. The Medallion of Power has been there in the comics for a long time, and during the comic runs back in the 90s, the Medallion of Power was actually shattered into numerous pieces, and they somehow made their way into different bloodlines, including the Ketch family line, that eventually produces Danny. Many thought that these fragments were powerless and just for decoration, but turns out that these fragments were capable of granting a bloodline the power of the spirit of vengeance. This means that whoever is carrying the fragment, whether they know about it or not, is actually carrying a relic that is much older and much more dangerous than anything they can even comprehend. This storyline actually matters a lot for how the entire mythology holds together, because it takes Ghost Rider out of the category of a one-off curse that happened to one unlucky guy who made a bad deal, and turns him into part of a much larger cosmic system with rules, history, and consequences stretching across generations. This means that Johnny was not just selected at random, and instead, he was always the chosen one, the one who was supposed to carry on being the host for the spirit of vengeance. This actually reminds me of a movie called The Covenant starring Sebastian Stan, where their bloodline possessed the powers of witches or something, and the idea that Johnny Blaze and Danny Ketch could have been like them is crazy. Imagine just like every single current age Ghost Rider just knowing each other so well, and all of them getting their powers one by one to form a group of Ghost Riders? Sheesh! Well, I know I'm blabbering a lot and the entire lore is a lot to introduce altogether, but the core idea is simple enough to hold on to. Ghost Rider power isn't random, and it isn't infinite either. It's a finite ancient force that got broken apart long ago and is still finding its way back together through the hosts who carry its pieces. How did the Midnight Suns era make Ghost Rider the heart of Marvel's horrorcore? The Midnight Suns era, which was built around the rise of the Midnight Suns crossover, pulled Ghost Rider out of his solo lane and dropped him into a much larger team of Marvel's occult characters, including numerous overpowered characters such as Morbius, Blade, the Night Stalkers, and Darkhold Redeemers, all fighting Lilith against demonic and supernatural threats tied loosely to the Darkhold. Now, if you know anything about the Darkhold, you know it is bad stuff. And although Ghost Rider is usually a one-man army kind of guy, but this story changes that because it kind of changes the kind of character Ghost Rider is allowed to be. From this story onwards, he was actually allowed to be a character more proficient in the dark arts and the mysteries of the Marvel Universe in a more supernatural manner. At a mythic level, this era also added more structure and rules to the world around him, as it introduced demons, vampire lords, cults, and multiple competing riders who interact with one another rather than exist in isolation. This kinda allows us to understand how many characters are actually orbiting around him during this entire era. And then it becomes clear why Ghost Rider is such a crucial part of Marvel and its horror genre in general. How is Robbie Reyes' Ghost Rider different from the classic Riders? Robbie Reyes was introduced in All New Ghost Rider #1 from 2014 as a street racer who was living in East Los Angeles, caring for his disabled younger brother while trying to keep both of them in a comfortable financial position. Unfortunately, he was soon shot and killed by mercenaries after an illegal street race where everyone thought he was gone forever. But due to a few different reasons, he came back to life after bonding with a possessed Hellcharger. And, fun fact, this Hellcharger was actually haunted by a murderous ghost named Eli Morrow, who was often seen sitting in the driver's seat instead of Robbie Reyes. This setup alone is very different from all the iterations of Ghost Rider we had seen so far, and it made him stand out like a skull on fire. Get me? Skull on fire? Ghost Rider? No? Anyway, Robbie's aesthetic was much more urban compared to Johnny's and Danny's gothic aesthetic, which made his origin feel a lot more hereditary and grounded than his predecessors. Like, the medallion was definitely important, but this curse was more personal than anything. On an anatomical level, Robbie's rider was actually directly tied to Eli Morrow's will, and this fully changed his version of movement and Hellfire, at least as compared to Johnny and Danny. Robbie's Ghost Rider has also shown up in a few Avengers comics, where the concept of Spirit of Vengeance actually seeps in deeper than his own issue, but it also separates him and highlights him as a much different rider compared to the ones who came before him. How do Ghost Rider's vehicles become part of his spectral anatomy? I know, I have taken a long time to reach this section, but come on, this is the one section the majority of you have been waiting on, so it is kind of fair that I put this section towards the end, right? Well, the wait is over. As we already know, a Ghost Rider's vehicle is not only made for looks and transportation. In Johnny and Danny's case, their bikes transformed literally with them into flaming, much cooler and gothic versions of themselves that defied gravity entirely, while tearing up the sides of buildings and covering impossible terrain like it was flat ground. Robbie's version decided to take this one step further with the Hellcharger as a possessed muscle car capable of slamming through walls and, in some depictions, warping space itself around it is pretty darn cool. The best way to explain how the rider and his ride are connected is to think of the vehicle as another body extension of the rider himself, just like the chain. The only difference is that instead of being a tendon or a nerve, it is more like an exoskeleton, a steed, a weapon, and also a symbol grouped up into one total being. Practically speaking, the vehicle does indeed allow the Ghost Rider to cover terrain that should be physically impossible for anyone to go through. But it also adds its own charm because in every version, the tire tracks actually also leave behind Hellfire, which can legitimately spread as far as he wants it to. Not only does this make the vehicle extremely cool, but imagine yourself as a goon, looking out in the darkness and seeing a burning vehicle charging at you with a skull on fire, while nothing but ashes and Hellfire are left behind it. Not only is that enough to make most people pee themselves, but it is also enough to be a warning for many. The bike or car has always been functioning as a genuine extension of the curse itself, not a separate object that the rider simply happens to be using. And that distinction is exactly why fans tend to remember the vehicle as vividly as they remember the skull. Why does Ghost Rider endure as one of Marvel's most distinct body horror heroes? Every piece of Ghost Rider's anatomy works together as one system, rather than a collection of separate powers. Basically, we now know that the host fully fuses with the spirit to form the Ghost Rider in the first place, and in this form Hellfire runs through his veins, which fuels his life and attacks alike. The chain acts like an extra, extendable limb, and the car or bike functions as an organ that gives him mobility and the surface area that no normal human body should be able to acquire. Even the skull stands as a symbol for judgment, while his skills, like the penance stare, work more like a jury, punishing the ones who are truly guilty of the crimes they have committed. In all honesty, Ghost Rider might just be the coolest looking character in all of Marvel, whose anatomy itself is based on vengeance. Johnny Blaze gave us the mythology's tragic core. He was a man who lost everything trying to save someone he loved. Danny Ketch took that tragedy and built it into a full myth, complete with bloodlines and legacy. And Robbie Reyes? Robbie literally reinvented the whole idea so that Ghost Rider could have a more modern, grounded setting. Once you put these three together, these three hosts prove that Ghost Rider is not just one story. The Ghost Rider is a collection of different people going through the same curse in their own maniacal ways, and that makes him one of Marvel's clearest fusions of horror, religion, and superheroics, all wrapped around a flaming skull. The Ghost Rider is not a superhero who is just a skull lit up on fire. He is quite literally an engine made to deliver punishment while being a human fused with the spirit of vengeance, who is rebuilt into something that is capable of burning up sins just as easily as it can melt steel. And trust me when I say this, it is something he can do without a second thought. Every rider, starting from Johnny Blaze all the way down to Robbie Reyes, has shown us that Ghost Rider might be the same curse, but their actions depend on the host, and the host itself is capable of changing major things about the Ghost Rider, all the way from looks to even their freaking weaknesses. Once you understand that, Ghost Rider's flaming anatomy stops being cosmetic and becomes the clearest image of what it looks like when vengeance is given bones and wheels. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, smash the subscribe button, and ring the bell icon so that you never miss another update from us. And, oh yeah, I almost forgot to mention, beware of the darkness outside because you just might see a flaming bike or a car on fire drive right next to your window. Until we meet again in our next video,